Welcome back to Hocus Pocus. We're on chapter 2. Let's go this way, Max said, quickly turning in the opposite direction, but Danny kept walking right toward the crowd. Ding ding, Ernie said, putting his arm down like a toll gate. Gotta stop and pay the toll, kid, said Jay. 10 chocolate bars, Ernie added, and no licorice. Just dump out your sack, Jay said. We'll pick what we want. Drop dead, moron, Danny snapped. Ernie stepped closer to her. Yo, twerp, how'd you like to get hung off that telephone pole? I'd like to see you try, Danny dared him. Because it just so happens that I've got my big brother with me. Max! She turned and waved at him. Max couldn't believe what Danny had gotten him into. As he came closer, he saw that Ernie was wearing his cross trainers. Hey, it's Hollywood, Ernie said. Doing a little trick-or-treating? Jay asked with a grin. The other guys in the crowd laughed. I'm just taking my little sister around, Max said, feeling mortified. That is, if that's okay with you. Protecting your baby sister, Jay smirked. Oh, that's nice, and I just love your costume. What are you supposed to be, a new kid on the block? The other guys laughed again. Danny put her hands on her hips and glared at Jay. For your information, she said, he's supposed to be a little leaguer. Now the guys really cracked up. Max wished he could disappear. He took Danny's arm and started to lead her away. Later, guys, he said to Jay and Ernie. Wait a minute, Ernie said. Everyone pays a toll. Stuff it, zip-face, Danny snapped. Why, you little... Ernie reached out to grab her. Max, Danny cried. Hey, Max had no choice but to jump between them. Ernie pressed his oily face right into Max's and clenched his fists. Max knew he was going to get creamed if he didn't think of something fast. Here, Ice, Max said, dropping his candy sack at Ernie's feet. Have fun pigging out. Ernie went for the sack, and Max quickly turned Danny around. As he led her away, Ernie called out behind them, Hey, Hollywood, the shoes fit great. The crowd of guys laughed, and Max and Danny walked back down the sidewalk. Max felt awful. You should have punched him, Danny muttered. Max couldn't believe it. He would have killed me. At least you would have died like a man, Danny said. That hurt. Hey, Max said angrily. You just humiliated me in front of half the guys at school. Go collect your candy and get out of my life. Danny scrunched her face up. I want to go home. Now, she shouted. She ran a little way down the sidewalk and then sat on some grass and started to cry. Now Max really felt bad. Even though Danny was a pain, she was just a little kid. Max knew he was all she had right now. Besides, if Danny told their father, Max would probably never get his learner's permit. He walked over and sat down next to her. Come on, Danny, he said, trying to be nice. Shut up, she shouted. I hate you. You've ruined everything. You ruined Halloween, and it was my favorite time of the year except Christmas and my birthday. Hey, I'm sorry, Max said. It's just that I hate Salem. I miss my friends. I want to go back home to California. This is your home now, Danny said with a sniff. You might as well get used to it. Max took a deep breath and sighed. He knew Danny was right. Yeah, how about giving me one more chance, okay? Why should I? Danny sniffed. Because I'm your brother, Max said. Danny shrugged and looked away. Max knew he had to get her back into the Halloween spirit or else wait until he was 17 to learn to drive. He pointed at the full moon. Hey, look, did you see that? What? Danny looked up. Something just flew across the moon, Max said. As Danny squinted upward, Max reached out and tickled her ribs. Ah! Danny jumped up. Breathing hard, she stared at her brother. Fooled you, Max grinned. Very funny, Danny crinkled her nose at him. Let's go, jerkface. They started down the street lined with old-fashioned gas streetlights. The houses here were the biggest Max had seen in Salem. He stopped in front of one mansion that had tall white columns in front. He'd never seen anything like it in California. Wow, Max gasped. Look at this house. The front door was open, and through it they could hear the sounds of laughter and talking. Rich people, Danny sounded disgusting. They'll probably make us drink cider and bob for apples. Come on, let's check it out, Max said. They went up the front walk and stepped into the house. The entryway was lit with glowing candles. A man wearing a white wig and a frock coat walked by. Max and Danny looked around uncertainly. Suddenly, Danny's eyes went wide. Jackpot, she said, stepping over to the big iron cauldron filled with candy. She started to fill her sack. Max was just about to join her when he heard the staircase above them creak. Looking up, he saw a beautiful girl at the top of the staircase. Her light brown hair was pulled into a bun, and she was wearing a gorgeous old-fashioned gown made of rose-colored silk. Allison? Max's jaw dropped. Danny quickly looked up. Not the Allison, she whispered. Max nodded. Allison smiled down at them. Thought you weren't into Halloween, she said as she started down the steps. I'm, taking my sister Danny around, Max replied. Well, that's nice of you, Allison said. I always do it, Max said. My parents made him, Danny added. Max gave Danny a look, and Allison laughed. She reached the bottom of the steps and turned to a punch bowl filled with cider. Want some? She asked, filling a cup and handing it to Max. Sure, thanks, Max said. So how's the party? Boring, Allison shrugged. It's just a bunch of my parents' friends. They do this every year, and I get candy duty. "By the way, Danny, I love your costume." "I love yours too," Danny said. "Of course, I can't wear anything like that because I don't have—" She turned to Max. "What do you call them, Max? Yabos?" Allison laughed, and Max practically choked on his cider. "Your costume looks really authentic," Allison told Danny. "I'm really into witches." "Me too," Danny said excitedly. "We just learned about those sisters in school." "The Sanderson sisters?" Allison asked. "I know all about them. My mom used to run the museum in the old Sanderson house." "There's a museum about them?" Danny looked surprised. "They shut it down," Allison said. "Too many spooky things happened there." Trying to think of any way to spend more time with Allison, Max suddenly had an idea. "If it's supposed to be so boogie scary, why don't we go up there? After all, tonight's the perfect night." "Well," Allison seemed uncertain. "Maybe you'll make a believer out of me," Max said hopefully. "Okay, but I'll have to change clothes," Allison said, and went back upstairs. Danny turned to Max. Her eyes were wide, and her lower lip was quivering. "There's no way I'm going up there, Max," she said with a trembling voice. "The kids at school told me about that place. It's supposed to be really weird." Max quickly glanced upstairs, then back at his sister. "So this is the girl of my dreams," he whispered. "Take her to the movies like a normal person," Danny whispered back. "Please," Max begged. "Do this one thing for me and I'll do anything you say." Danny thought it over. "Okay, next year we go trick-or-treating as Wendy and Peter Pan." It took Max a moment to realize what that meant. "I have to wear tights?" He practically choked on the word. Danny nodded. "Green ones." Max took a deep breath. It sounded worse than death, but it wasn't until next year. In the meantime, he could get to know Allison better. "Okay, it's a deal." Allison came back downstairs wearing a beige sweater and jeans. Her hair was now down around her shoulders. The three of them left Allison's house and were soon climbing the hill toward the Sandersons. A thin mist hung in the air, and the light of the full moon glowed through the treetops. Allison held Danny's hand. Ahead was a wooden sign covered with peeling paint. Sanderson House, circa 1660. Home of Winifred, Mary, and Sarah Sanderson. Open noon till 5 p.m., Monday through Saturday. Donation 50 cents. On the ground next to it lay another, newer sign that had fallen over. Closed. No trespassing. They stopped and looked up at the dark house. "My mom used to run this place," Allison said, "but tourists kept having heart attacks and accidents. Finally, the town closed it." "Well, now we've seen it," Danny said nervously, "so we can go." The house looked old and creepier than Max had expected. The brick chimney was bent, one of the shutters hung loosely from a window, and some of the roof tiles were missing. Dried leaves made a rustling sound as they swirled in a sudden gust. Max hesitated, but he knew if they turned back now, Allison might decide to go home. Besides, he didn't want to look like a wimp. "Wait," he said, "let's take a closer look." They started toward the house. An old water wheel stood beside it, but the stream that fed the wheel had dried up long before. As they got closer, Max saw that the windows were made of wavy old glass and gave off weird, distorted reflections. Suddenly, something small and dark shot across their path. "What was that?" Danny gasped. Max and Allison looked around. On the path near the front door, a pair of yellow eyes glistened in the moonlight. "It's just a cat," Max said. "Not just a cat," Allison said. "It's the cat. The one that warned you not to go in." As if it had heard her, the cat yowled. Max picked up a stone and threw it. The cat yelped in pain and disappeared into the shadows. Allison gave Max a look. "I didn't mean to hit it," he explained, feeling guilty. "I just wanted to scare it away." Before Allison could respond, it suddenly grew even darker outside. Max looked up and saw that a cloud was drifting in front of the moon. He really didn't want to go any farther, but he couldn't leave now. Allison probably thought he was a jerk for throwing that rock at the cat. He had to prove to her that he wasn't. "Let's go inside," Max said. Danny crossed her arms and shook her head. "No way." "Way," Max said with an exaggerated nod. "I want to take the tour." "Well, okay," Allison said a little reluctantly, "but we'll only stay a minute." She reached up to the ledge of the door and found an old key. The wooden door creaked as it opened. It was so dark inside that Max could hardly see. Danny grabbed Allison's hand and held tight. Max took a step inside. The air smelled stale and musty. "I can't see anything," Danny complained. "There's a light switch here somewhere," Allison said. Max took another step and felt something small and hard under his foot. He picked it up. "Hey, I found a lighter," he said. He tried it, and the wick caught. The room was lit with its faint, flickering flame. Across the room, 3 bent old women suddenly appeared, huddled around a large iron cauldron in the fireplace. "Ah!" Danny screamed in terror, and Max jumped. At that moment, Allison found the light switch. The room was flooded with light, and they could see the old women more clearly. "They're fake," Allison said. Max turned to his sister. "See? They're just dummies, dummy." He stuck her tongue out at him and looked around. The room was from another era. The floors, walls, and ceiling were made of old wood planks. Everything had a silvery layer of dust on it, and heavy cobwebs spanned the corners. Dried animal bones and shriveled clumps of herbs hung from the rafters. The dusty shelves along the walls were filled with oddly shaped blue and brown glass bottles. The only modern addition to the room was a red carpet bordered by gold velvet ropes that led visitors through the house. Max picked up one of the old bottles and shook it. Wow, there's still liquid in it. Probably some kind of potion, Allison said. Yeah, right. Max pretended he believed that. Danny stepped cautiously toward the three dummies and stared at the one with the red hair. That's Winifred, the eldest sister, said Allison. Her father was a warlock. She pointed to a chubby woman whose dark hair curled like a horn on top of her head. This is Mary, the middle sister. Her father was a bloodhound. She could follow the scent of a child for miles. Is this Sarah? Danny pointed at the youngest and prettiest of the three. Sarah had a shapely figure and beautiful, thick blonde hair. Yes, said Allison, the strange one. She would lure children, usually young boys, into the woods to play, and then they would never be seen again. Allison stepped up to the glass case. Inside was an ancient-looking book about the width of a big dictionary. The cover looked moldy, and the edges of its thick pages were brownish and tattered. She read from a small placard on the case. The spell book of Winifred Sanderson, given to her by the devil himself. It contains the recipes for her most powerful and evil spells. The book is said to be bound in the skin of a human child. Ah, Danny screamed again, making them all jump. Now what? Max asked, annoyed. Something just ran between my legs, Danny gasped. It's just that stupid cat, Max said. He started to look around again. His eyes stopped on a huge lone candle, and he read the placard on the stand beneath it. The black flame candle, made from the fat of a hanged man. Legend says that it will raise the spirits of the dead when lit by a virgin on Halloween night. The room was suddenly aglow with moonlight coming through the windows. Danny jumped again, and even Allison looked nervous. Chill, guys, it's just the moon coming out from behind a cloud, Max said, still looking at the candle. He knew he had a chance to look really brave. What do you say we light this thing and meet the old broads? He raised the lighter toward the candle. Before he could light it, the black cat leapt out of the darkness and clawed his back with a yowl. Hey, get this thing off me, Max shouted, twisting and swinging his arms. The cat fell to the floor and scampered away. Max flicked the lighter. Max, no! Allison and Danny shouted together as the flame leapt out of the lighter, and Max held it to the candle. Oh, come on, Max said. I'm just going to prove to you once and for all that this is just a bunch of hocus pocus. The cat let out another shrieking yowl, but it was too late. The flame from the lighter touched the candle's wick. Kerpow! Every light bulb in the room exploded. A dark wind raced around the room, kicking up dust and tearing cobwebs from the corners. Max, Danny, and Allison instinctively ducked. Ha 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 ha! Cruel, cackling laughter filled the room. As suddenly as they'd started, the wind and laughter stopped. The room became still. Max's heart was beating like a drum. What happened? He whispered. A virgin just lit the candle, Danny whispered back. Max heard Allison chuckle. Sometimes he wished Danny wasn't so smart for her age. Anyway, maybe the lights blowing out was just a coincidence? For Allison's sake, he tried to act brave. Ugh, right, he said, looking up. And look, nothing happened. Before he could finish the sentence, the door flew open and a woman with red hair stepped into the room. Max's eyes almost popped out of his head when he saw that her black and red gown was smoldering as if she'd just stepped up from the flames of hell. Danny crawled under a table, and Allison quickly scurried into a shadowy corner. Max hid in a broom closet, squeezing in beside a vacuum cleaner, a dust mop, and some old straw brooms. The woman stepped into the room and looked around as if she was glad to be home. Behind her came a chubbier woman with black hair, and then a younger, shapely woman with thick blonde hair. Max couldn't believe his eyes. They looked exactly like the three Sanderson dummies. Ah, sweet revenge, the red-haired woman exclaimed. My curse worked perfectly. Because thou art perfect, Winnie, said the chubby one. Winnie is short for Winifred, Max thought with a tremble, like Winifred Sanderson. No, it couldn't be. But who lit the candle? Winifred asked. Sarah Sanderson pulled up a loose floorboard and lifted something from beneath it. My lucky rat tail, she screeched, just where I left it. Max felt his jaw drop. It was them. He watched in amazement as Mary stepped toward the dummies of herself and her sisters. Oh, look, she giggled. Are these not clever sisters? They appear so lifelike. That doth not look anything like me, Winifred said, turning up her nose. Well, of course not, sister, Mary said with what seemed to Max to be fake sweetness. They have missed that special glow of thy skin, and the way, whack, Winifred smacked Mary across the back of her head. They made her much too old, Winifred informed her sister. It seemed to Max that the Winifred dummy looked about the same age as the real one. Winifred turned and stepped toward the glass case where the spellbook lay. "Wake up, my sleepy one," she said, tapping the glass gently. "Did thou miss me? I missed thee." With a crash, she thrust her hands through the glass and lifted the book out. Max couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was definitely time to leave. But how? "Come, my darling," Winifred cooed to her book. "We have work to do." "Wait," Mary gasped, sniffing loudly. "I smell children. One is most definitely a young girl, 7, maybe 8 years old." The 3 witches quickly began to scan the room. Max backed farther into the closet. "Let's play with her," Sarah said with a wicked smile. "Come out, my dear," Winifred called in a sing-song voice. "We shall not harm thee." "Yes," Mary said, licking her lips. "We love children." Winifred suddenly up into the table Danny was hidden under. Max's sister cowered for a moment, then looked down at her Halloween costume and compared it with those of the witches. "I thought thou'st would never come, sisters," she said, rising bravely and pretending to be a witch also. Max couldn't believe how gutsy she was. "Greetings, little one," Winifred said with a knowing smile. "'Twas I who brought you back," Danny said. The 3 witches gathered around her, pawing at her hair and poking her with their fingers. "Such a pretty little—" Winifred seemed to choke on the next word. "Child." "And so well fed," Mary said, squeezing one of Danny's arms. "Tell me, Dumpling," Winifred said, leaning closer, "what is the year?" 1993, Danny stammered fearfully. Winifred straightened up. "Sisters, we have been dead for 300 years. My, how time flies," Mary giggled. "Especially when you're dead," Sarah cried. The witches howled with laughter. Danny joined in. Max felt a sickening sensation in his stomach. He doubted the witches believed Danny's act. "Well, I guess I'll be going," Danny said, taking a step toward the door. Winifred quickly blocked her path. "Oh, do stay for dinner, dearest," she said. I'm not hungry," Danny gasped. "Oh, but we are." Mary grabbed her. Max knew he had to do something. "Hey!" he shouted, jumping out from the closet. "Let go of my sister." The next thing Max knew, Winifred whirled around and pointed her bony hands at him. Zap! Max felt a sudden shock, as if he had touched a live electrical wire. He was lifted off the ground, unable to break free of the electrical force. "Roast him, Winnie," Mary urged. "No, let me play with him," Sarah said, moving closer. "You leave my brother alone." Danny swung her candy sack at Winifred, knocking her sideways. A second later, Max crumpled to the floor in a daze. Winifred turned to grab Danny, but the black cat leapt onto the witch's shoulder and clawed her. Mary reached for the cat, but Allison jumped out of the shadows and punched Mary in the nose. "Here, kitty, kitty," Sarah giggled in the middle of the fracas. Still on the floor, Max slowly came to his senses. It was becoming obvious that they didn't stand a chance against the witches. They had to get out of there fast. He looked up and noticed another modern addition to the old house. "Beware!" he shouted, jumping up on a table and flicking his lighter again. The 3 witches suddenly stopped and stared at him. "You have messed with a great and powerful Max," he shouted, holding the lighter's flame up to the indoor sprinkler system. "You must now suffer the consequences. I summon the burning rain of death." Bring! Somewhere in the house a fire alarm went off. Whoosh! A sprinkler started spraying water all over the room. "The burning rain of death!" Sarah shrieked in terror. As Max jumped off the table, he came face to face with the black cat. "Nice move, Max," the cat said. "Huh?" Max stared at it in disbelief. "First real witches, now a talking cat?" "Right, I talk," the cat said. "Now get the spellbook and let's scram." The witches were racing around, trying to escape the burning rain of death. Danny and Allison headed for the door. Max grabbed the book and followed. As he ran from the house, he could hear Winifred scream, "It's only water! The boy hath tricked us and stolen my book! After them, sisters!" Max dashed down the hill. Ahead near the street, he could see the cat motioning Allison and Danny to hide in the shadows between 2 parked cars. The girls ducked down, and Max joined them. "Are you Thackeray Binks?" Allison whispered to the cat. "No, I'm Garfield's long-lost cousin," the cat hissed. "Now be quiet." Crouching between the cars, Max still couldn't believe what was going on. Witches and a talking cat? He pinched himself. It hurt. This wasn't a dream. A few moments later, the 3 witches reached the edge of the street and stopped. "A black river," Mary gasped. "What is that?" Sarah asked, pointing to the car Max and the others were hiding behind. Winifred stepped toward the car. Max held his breath as the witches bent down and squinted. "'Tis a ford," Winifred said. "Obviously a vessel for fording this river." "What shall we do?" Mary asked. "Perhaps it is not too deep," Sarah said, sticking her toe out tentatively. Winifred and Mary shared a look and pushed Sarah off the curb. "Help!" Sarah shrieked as she stumbled into the street. "I cannot swim!" Then she realized she wasn't sinking. "'Tis firm as stone," Winifred said, stepping into the street. "I believe it is a road." The witches quickly hurried across the street. As soon as they were gone, the cat jumped away from the car and headed in the opposite direction. "Come on," he hissed. "Wait a minute, Binks," Max said. "Where are you taking us?" Binks stared back at them with yellow eyes. "The graveyard." A light mist floated over the graveyard, and the moonlight cast weird shadows among the trees. Thin and flat, many of the gravestones leaned to one side. To Max, the whole scene was not only totally bizarre, but creepy too. "Why did we have to come here?" Max asked. "This is the one place the Sanderson sisters can't touch us," Binks replied. "Get serious," Max muttered. "I am," Binks replied. "You're saying I have to spend the rest of my life in a graveyard?" "Not the rest of your life," Binks said, "just until dawn." "Why dawn?" Allison asked as they walked past the graves. "If the Sanderson sisters don't steal the life of a child by the first light, they'll evaporate," Binks explained. "If we can keep the spellbook away from them until dawn, the witches basically get nuked." "Hey," Max said, "if you're from the old days like these witches, how come you don't talk like them?" "Because unlike them, I have been alive for the past 300 years. Allison suddenly stopped and brought her hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she gasped. "What's wrong?" Max asked. "It's Halloween. There are children everywhere tonight." "Oh man, the Sanderson sisters will have a feast," Max groaned. "This is all your fault, Max," Danny said. "My fault," Max said. "Who's the one who made me go trick-or-treating?" "Who lit the candle?" Allison asked, half accusingly and half teasing. "Who took us up to the house?" Max shot back. "Hey," Binks snapped, "can we fight about this later?" "Ah!" Danny gasped, then froze. Max bumped into her and looked up to find a skeleton holding a long knife-like scythe. It took a second for them to realize that it was only an engraving on a tall old gravestone. The inscription read, "William Butcherson, lost soul." Billy Butcherson was Winifred's lover, Binks explained, jumping on top of an old tombstone, but she found him sporting with her sister Sarah. "Sporting?" Danny repeated, puzzled. Allison and Max glanced at each other. "It's like when you have one girlfriend, but you mess around with someone else," Max tried to explain. "Oh, you mean Billy cheated on Winifred," Danny said. "Why didn't you just say so?" Binks cleared his throat. "Anyway, when Winifred found out, she poisoned Billy and then sewed his lips shut with a dull needle so he couldn't tell her secrets, even in death." "I guess Winifred is the jealous type," Allison said. Yes," Binks said. "Now please sit down. There's a lot you should know before the fun begins." "Fun?" Max scowled. "Okay, it was a poor choice of words," Binks admitted. "Now please sit." Danny and Allison sat, but Max remained standing. It was still hard for him to believe that a talking cat who had once been Thackeray Binks was talking to them. Not only that, but he was giving them orders. Max realized that Binks was staring at him. "You have a problem?" Binks asked. No." Max sat. "This is your sister's headstone, isn't it?" Allison asked, pointing to the headstone Binks was perched on. The faint inscription read, "Emily Binks." "Yes," the cat said. "Because of me, my little sister's life was stolen. For years I waited for my life as a cat to end so that I could be reunited with her in death. But Winifred's curse of immortality kept me alive. I watched my parents and all my friends grow old and die. I was miserable. Then one day I realized my immortality gave me a purpose. I'd failed Emily, but I wouldn't fail again. So for 3 centuries I've guarded the Sanderson house on Halloween to stop any airhead virgins from lighting the black flame candle and bringing the sisters back." Max realized they were all staring at him. "Nice going, airhead," Danny muttered. "Hey, I'm sorry, okay?" Max said defensively. "But we're talking about 3 old hags versus the 20th century. How bad can it be?" "Bad," Binks said. "Believe me." Max, Allison, and Danny gave each other nervous looks. "Maybe this could help?" Allison took the spellbook from Max and started to open it. "Hey," Binks yelled. "Stay out of there." Allison quickly shut the book. "Never open that book again," Binks warned. "It contains all of Winifred's most powerful spells. Whatever we do, we can't let her get her claws on it." "So why are we messing around?" Max asked, taking the book back from Allison and pulling out his lighter. "Let's just torch this sucker. Then those witches will never be able to steal any lives. Stand back, everyone. This baby's gonna burn." The flame burst out of the lighter, but before Max could touch it to the book exhaled. A big ball of fire exploded in front of Max's face. "Yikes!" Max jumped back, dropping the book. His eyebrows were singed. "It's protected by magic," Binks explained. "Why didn't you warn me?" Max asked. "Why did you throw that rock at me before?" Binks replied, licking his paw. Suddenly they heard evil laughter and looked up. The 3 witches were hovering directly above them on old straw brooms. Max and the others cowered on the ground. "Why didn't you warn me? Why didn't you warn me?" Sarah and Mary mimicked Max. "Still think it's just a bunch of hocus pocus?" Winifred asked with an evil grin. Max realized Allison was watching him. "Yo, hags," he shouted, trying to look brave. "Get lost!" Winifred stared down at him. Max felt as if she were staring straight into his soul. It sent a shiver through him. "Ah, it's the brave little virgin who lit the candle," Winifred said with a leer. "He misses his friends. He wants to go home. Boo-hoo-hoo." Mary and Sarah pretended to cry. Max felt totally humiliated. Then Sarah dipped toward him. "I'll be thy friend," she said with an enticing wink. "Take a hike," Allison shouted at her. Max turned and smiled at Allison, who looked away. "She's jealous," Winifred said. "And isn't she pretty? Almost as pretty as her ancestor, little Elizabeth Podbury, the good witch." "Good to the very last bite," Mary cried, licking her lips. The witches cackled with wicked glee. Then Winifred reached out her hand. "Book!" she cried. The spell book started to rise off the ground, but Binks jumped off the tombstone and landed on it, pinning it to the earth. Winifred's eyes narrowed. "Thackeray Binks, still alive, and waiting for you," Binks replied. "You've waited in vain," Winifred snapped. "You will fail to save thy friends, just as you failed to save thy sister." Max had never seen a cat flinch before, but he was certain Binks did then. Above them, the witches began to chant, "Iki-tau, iki-tu-tau, iki-ti-tau." "Don't listen to them," Allison shouted, covering her ears. Danny and Max quickly did the same. "Blast them," Winifred shouted. She and her sister swooped downward on their brooms, but the kids ducked and flattened themselves on the cold ground. The witches flew back up into the sky and huddled for a moment. Max gave Binks a nervous look. "As long as we stay here, they can't touch us, right?" he asked nervously. "They can't," Max replied. "I don't like the way you said that," Danny said nervously. Above them, Winifred called out, "Unfaithful lover, long since dead, deep asleep in a wormy bed, wiggle thy toe, open thine eye, twist thy fingers toward the sky. Life is sweet, so don't be shy. On thy feet, so saith I." As Max watched, Winifred pulled the black flame candle out of her cape and blew on it. A flame burst onto the wick. Suddenly, the ground beneath Max began to rumble. He and the others jumped to their feet. The tombstone over Billy Butcherson's grave fell backward, and the ground bulged. Jagged shards of wood from an old coffin shot up through the earth. Then a body sat up. "Billy Butcherson!" Allison gasped. Danny jumped behind Max and hugged him in terror. Billy looked very gaunt and bony. His skin was gray, his hair long and frizzy. He was wearing an ancient moldy frock coat, and his lips were sewn together. "He's a zombie!" Danny cried. The stench of rotten flesh wafted into Max's nose. "And he stinks, too!" The kids watched in terror as Billy looked around with sleepy eyes, then lay back down in his coffin. "Get up, you rotter!" Winifred screamed and gave him a jolt of electricity. With an angry groan, Billy sat up again. "Oh, Billy!" Sarah sighed forlornly for her old boyfriend. Whack! Winifred smacked her and then shouted at Billy, "Catch those children!" Billy turned and stared at the kids. He pulled himself to his feet and began to stagger toward them. "Is this for real?" Max stammered, backing away. "You better believe it," Binks shouted, starting to run. "Follow me, and don't forget the spell book." "But we can't leave the graveyard," Max yelled as he grabbed the book. "Just do what he says, Max," Danny said. They started to run through the tombstones and trees. The witches hovered over them, and Billy followed, picking up speed. Max looked back and realized the zombie was gaining on them. He stopped and grabbed a tree patch, bending it way back. As Billy staggered toward him with his bony hands outstretched, Max let go of the branch. Crack! The branch swung back and hit Billy in the face, knocking his head clear off his body. Billy's head rolled under a tree, and his body flopped to the ground. Max stopped and let out a big sigh of relief. One less zombie to worry about. Then Billy's body rose to his hands and knees and started groping around for its head. Max stared in disbelief, then turned and ran. Ahead, Binks was nearing the graveyard wall. The witches hovered above it on their broomsticks, waiting with evil grins on their faces. Danny and Allison were following close behind Binks, but Max slowed down. "Come on," Binks shouted. "But the witches," Max gasped. "Just do it, Max," Allison yelled. Binks approached the wall. Sarah hovered just beyond it. "Here, kitty, kitty," she called. Just before Binks reached the wall, he disappeared behind a clump of brambles. A second later, Danny and Allison disappeared too, but Max hesitated. "Blast that Thackeray Binks!" Winifred shrieked. "Blast him! Blast him! Blast him! Blast him! Blast him!" Mary and Sarah chanted. Whack! Whack! Winifred smacked her sisters. On the ground below, it looked to Max as if the witches had a real Three Stooges routine going. Suddenly, Max smelled something disgusting. He spun around. Billy was right behind him. He'd put his head back on, but it was twisting too far to the left, so he could only stare at Max out of the corner of his eyes. Still clutching the spellbook, Max took a step back. His heart pounding, he couldn't breathe. He felt paralyzed with fear as the zombie's long, dirty fingernails reached toward him.